I still remember the exact moment all 11 wolves stopped advancing at once. Just seconds earlier, they had been packed tightly around the off-road vehicle, claws scraping over gravel, white teeth showing in the pale light of dawn. I was kneeling on the roof with one hand holding the camera when the scar-faced alpha took another step toward us. Then the ground began to shake. A branch snapped somewhere inside the fir forest, followed by footsteps so heavy that I could feel the roof trembling beneath my knees. Every wolf turned at once. From the darkness between the trees, a massive Bigfoot slowly stepped into view. He stood nearly 10 feet tall, broad shoulders blocking most of the sunrise behind him, dark brown fur matted with mud from head to toe, long arms hanging almost to his knees. He didn't charge, he didn't roar wildly. He simply stood there watching the wolves as though he understood exactly what was happening. The alpha backed away. Bigfoot tilted his head and released a single roar so deep that it struck the rock wall and rolled across the entire valley. Right in front of me, the whole wolf pack began to retreat. It's Victor again. Welcome back to Bigfoot Sasquatch Stories. Tonight's story has been recreated by our editorial team as a work of creative fiction inspired by unpublished accounts connected to the Frank Church wilderness. Some details have been dramatized to make the story more cinematic, but the fear and wonder people feel toward the unexplained mysteries of nature are very real. Don't forget to subscribe, and now let's return to that sunrise in 1875. The golden light only lasts about 10 minutes, Jamie. If you leave the aperture too wide for too long, you'll blow out the edges of the wolf's fur and lose all the detail. Alina Vasquez spoke without taking her eyes off the windshield, where the darkness ahead of the vehicle was slowly fading into a strip of blue-gray. The dashboard clock read 4:07 a.m. On June 12, 1875, the off-road vehicle rattled steadily along a dirt road leading deep into the Frank Church wilderness of Idaho, its headlights sweeping across lodgepole pines, Douglas firs, and patches of low brush still wet with morning dew. Jamie Ostrowski sat behind Elena, hugging a handheld camera to her chest as if one bad pothole might send it crashing to the floor. At 27, she was the youngest member of the crew, and somehow still awake enough to keep asking about shutter speed, focal length, and the direction of the coming light, even though they had left the station while most of the nearby town was still asleep. Elena turned slightly and showed Jamie how to keep the exposure lower than usual, while the sun was still below the mountain ridge. Don't try to make the scene brighter than it really is. What we need is the eyes, shoulders, and movement of the wolves slowly appearing through the light. If they hunt at dawn, let the darkness do half the work. Jamie nodded, adjusted the focus ring, then tested the lens through the right side window. Grant Whitlock sat in the back with one leg wedged between two equipment cases, quietly checking the batteries one last time. 20 years of wildlife filmmaking had taught him to trust routine more than luck. Every battery was marked with colored tape, each memory card sat in its own numbered case, and the main camera rested across his lap with the lens cap already removed. They were looking for one specific wolf pack Elena had been tracking through GPS collars for months, and if the previous night's data was accurate, all 11 wolves were somewhere near a denning area, with pups farther to the northeast. Cole Baxter, the man behind the wheel, heard the entire conversation without turning around. He was 52, born in Idaho, and had spent years guiding hunters, rangers, biologists, and film crews into places where maps were little more than tightly packed contour lines. His left hand stayed on the steering wheel, while his right occasionally touched the gear shift as the vehicle crawled over short grades. Every few minutes he glanced at the clock, and then at the eastern sky growing brighter, not because he was impatient to reach the filming site, but because he knew the best light was also the time when wildlife changed position fastest. "I'm going to say this one more time," Cole said, his voice calm but loud enough to carry over the engine. "Once we enter the core area, nobody gets out on their own. I've taken 2 other crews near this place, and both times I made them stop more than half a mile out. It's pup season. Wolves protecting a den are not the same. Wolves you see standing along a road in Yellowstone. Elena glanced at Cole and nodded. She understood he wasn't trying to scare anyone. Over months of studying collar signals, she had watched this pack tighten its range around the den after the pups were born. Whenever one adult moved farther away, others shifted position. It was a familiar defensive pattern, but the pack's concentration over the past several days had caught her attention. I've irritated bison, bobcats, one grizzly in Montana, and a bull moose that tried to turn my camera into a toy, Grant said from the back. If I'm still afraid of a wolf pack after 20 years, Elena probably hired the wrong cameraman. Cole looked at him in the rearview mirror. You don't have to be afraid of them. You just have to respect the distance. Grant gave a quiet laugh, but one hand still reached over and checked the door lock beside him without thinking. Elena switched on the receiver resting across her knees. The small screen displayed a series of symbols and location points downloaded from the tracking data before they had lost network access farther into the wilderness. She pulled up the pack's movement over the previous 3 days. There's something I didn't explain clearly last night, she said. The mood inside the vehicle shifted just enough that Jamie stopped playing with the focus ring. Elena explained that the pack contained 11 wolves, making it one of the largest groups documented in the area since gray wolves had been restored through the reintroduction program in the mid-1990s. Their number wasn't the unusual part. Over the past 2 weeks, the GPS data showed that they had been moving far more than normal inside their own territory. On some nights, they left the denning area, circled into another branch of the valley, then returned before sunrise. 2 adults had covered more than twice their usual distance without any sign that they were pursuing prey. If I saw it for one night, I'd call it a failed hunt, Elena said. But when it keeps happening, it starts looking like they're avoiding one area, then going back later to check it again. Cole asked which area. Elena enlarged the map and pointed to a section southwest of the pack's territory where no clear trail appeared. Cole gave it one quick look and immediately returned his attention to the road. He didn't comment. He only eased off the accelerator as the front wheel slipped through a rocky rut. Jamie was the one who broke the silence. Maybe they're running from a bear? Grant asked whether another wolf pack could be pushing into their territory. Elena shook her head. No neighboring collared pack had entered that zone, and the howls recorded by the audio stations didn't indicate an active conflict between 2 packs. Cole kept driving, his eyes moving between the road and the sky. A faint wash of gold had begun to appear along the eastern horizon, enough to separate individual tree trunks from the darkness behind them. He told them they had less than 20 minutes before the best light was gone, assuming no landslide blocked the road. Grant replaced the battery in his main camera, even though the one inside still had more than half its charge, then checked the memory card again. Jamie watched him and asked whether she should do the same. Grant told her to keep her camera ready, because the best thing she would ever film would probably appear while she was looking down for another battery. The road changed after a tight bend. What had been a relatively broad dirt track narrowed until one side pressed against a sheer gray rock wall, while the other dropped through dense timber toward a deep ravine. Cole slowed until the vehicle was barely crawling. The right tires rolled close to soft ground at the edge, while the left mirror passed only a few feet from stone. He leaned forward to look through the windshield and told them this was the final stretch before their planned filming point. From there would be nowhere to turn around for at least half a mile. Grant looked out the window and saw pine trunks packed so densely below the ravine that he couldn't see the bottom. Nobody brought up the question of what the wolves might have been avoiding inside their own territory, but the question remained in the vehicle anyway, mixed with the sound of tires grinding over gravel and the slow arrival of daylight across the road ahead. Cole shifted into low gear and moved forward in short, careful stretches. The trail was barely wide enough for one vehicle and had no real shoulder. To the left, the rock wall rose almost directly beside the doors, its broken surface covered with loose fragments that looked ready to fall. To the right, the ground ended after a narrow strip of grass and dropped sharply into the forest. Grant checked the time. It was 4:31 a.m. The golden light Elena had been waiting for was arriving faster than expected, but he didn't tell Cole to hurry. Elena lowered her eyes to the GPS receiver. A new signal had appeared near the edge of the screen. She touched it, checked the collar identification, then sat straighter. "The adult female is close." Cole asked how close. Elena checked the distance, frowned, then checked the map scale again. Less than 400 yards. Grant leaned forward. That distance meant the pack had moved toward the trail since the last data update. Elena pulled in more information. A second point appeared, then a third. Instead of clustering around the den the way she had expected, the markers were spread along the area near the road they were traveling. "They're scattered," she said, "or they're moving." Jamie immediately lifted her camera, excitement returning to her face. She asked whether they might actually see the wolves from the vehicle. Elena said maybe, but there was no excitement in her voice. Having several members of the pack move this close to the road at the same time no longer felt like good luck. Cole eased farther off the accelerator. His eyes moved left, then right, never resting anywhere for more than a moment. Grant had spent enough time with experienced wilderness guides to recognize the change. Cole wasn't simply driving anymore. He was reading the forest. "Something wrong?" Grant asked. Cole didn't answer immediately. He tilted his head slightly, listening, beyond the engine, then said the woods were too quiet. Elena lowered the receiver and looked outside with her own eyes. Another GPS point appeared. This time, Elena didn't need to enlarge the map. 4 wolves, she said. Then she corrected herself. No, 5. The receiver updated slowly, the symbols shifting in small jumps as the collars transmitted. One signal was ahead of them. 2 were off to the right. Another had moved from the left toward the trail. Cole tightened his grip on the wheel. Grant switched on the main camera. Jamie still hadn't completely lost her excitement. Elena reminded her not to open the window. Jamie nodded without taking her eyes off the trees. Grant looked at Cole. His jaw was tight now, his right foot resting over the brake, while his eyes tracked the road ahead and the rearview mirror as though he were already calculating a retreat he knew probably didn't exist. "Cole?" Grant called again. "What do you see?" Cole had just opened his mouth when a gray shape flashed along the forest edge to the left. It appeared for less than a second between 2 tree trunks, low, long, and fast, then vanished behind the alder. Jamie jerked toward the window. "Wolf," Elena said immediately. Grant swung the camera around, but captured only branches still moving after the animal had passed. Cole didn't accelerate. He kept the vehicle moving so slowly it was almost idling in first gear. A few seconds later, another shape appeared on the right, running parallel to them through a gap between the trees before disappearing again. This time Jamie caught several frames. She looked at her screen, mouth opening in excitement, but Elena placed a hand on her arm. "Don't only watch through the camera. Watch both sides." A third shape appeared farther ahead on the left, then a fourth moved behind a cluster of trees on the right. They weren't charging the vehicle, but they also weren't running from the sound of the engine. Each wolf maintained roughly the same distance from the road, while traveling in the same direction as the vehicle. Grant remembered what Elena had said about the pack behaving as though it had been avoiding something. The thought felt different now as tree trunks passed through his frame. If the wolves were fleeing a threat, they should have been putting distance between themselves and this area. What Grant saw instead looked more like formation than retreat. Two wolves on the right moved forward when the vehicle slowed. One on the left stopped behind a pine and reappeared farther uphill. They were keeping the vehicle between them. Cole touched the brake. Nobody opens a door. Nobody puts an arm or a head outside. His voice had changed completely. The easy calm from earlier was gone. Elena looked at the GPS and then toward the windshield. Signals were appearing around their position. Jamie asked whether this could be den defense behavior. Elena didn't answer right away. She had seen wolves defend breeding areas, watched them shadow humans from a distance, bark warnings, and in rare cases move closer. But several animals appearing simultaneously on both sides of a moving vehicle was unlike anything she had encountered in the field. "Stay calm," she said. "Don't do anything that makes them think we're pursuing them." The road ahead curved gently around a rocky outcrop. Cole leaned forward, trying to see past it, his foot still resting over the brake. Grant raised the camera and focused on the stretch of road turning gold in the early light. The first gray wolf stepped out. It didn't run. It stood in the middle of the trail, with its body turned sideways and its head facing the vehicle. A second wolf came out of the forest on the right and stopped several yards away. Then a third descended from the slope on the left. Jamie stopped breathing for a moment. Elena looked down at the GPS and then through the windshield, matching the electronic points to the real bodies appearing in front of them, one by one. Cole slammed on the brakes. The vehicle lurched forward and stopped. Jamie's camera struck the back of the seat. Grant had to brace one hand against the roof to keep his balance, but he never let go of the camera. Two more wolves emerged from the trees ahead. 5 gray bodies now stood scattered across a road, barely wide enough for one vehicle, leaving no opening large enough to drive through. In the right side mirror, Grant saw another wolf step out behind them. On the left, branches continued to shake as more gray shapes moved alongside the vehicle. Nobody inside was talking about golden light anymore. Elena counted the wolves she could see, then checked the signals on her receiver. Cole kept his foot on the brake and both hands on the steering wheel. Jamie still held her camera, but the excitement had disappeared from her face. Ahead of them, the largest wolf in the group took one more step into the center of the trail. He raised his head and stared straight through the windshield, and from both sides of the forest, the rest of the pack began closing in. The vehicle had barely come to a complete stop when the air inside seemed to compress around them. Grant kept the camera pointed through the windshield, but the frame no longer held the sunrise they had gotten up at 4 in the morning to capture. 5 wolves stood ahead, spread across the narrow trail. The largest one in the center had high shoulders, darker gray fur than the others, and an old scar running from the bridge of its muzzle toward the edge of its jaw. It wasn't looking at the vehicle like an animal surprised by an obstacle. It stood still with its head slightly lowered, staring directly into the cabin. On the right, 2 more wolves had left the tree line and moved closer to the passenger door. Behind them, in the rearview mirror, Grant saw another gray shape step into the road. Elena looked down at the GPS receiver, then outside, counting quickly. In less than a minute, all 11 wolves had appeared. Nobody inside the vehicle believed this was a chance encounter anymore. There was no truly safe opening left. 5 wolves blocked the road ahead. 3 held the forest edge on the right, where the ground dropped into the ravine. 2 stayed to the left, near the rock wall. The last one stood behind the vehicle, where the trail was too narrow for Cole to turn around. The only gap that looked remotely like an escape route was against the steep cliff, and even someone without equipment would have struggled to climb it. Cole kept the engine running, but didn't touch the accelerator. He could have tried to push forward and perhaps hit one of the wolves, but the trail wasn't wide enough to maneuver if the pack rushed beneath the vehicle or forced a wheel over the edge. Elena kept staring outside, her expression tighter than it had been at any point that morning. She had spent years studying wolves. She had stood within a few dozen yards of wild packs under controlled conditions, watched them defend kills and drive intruders from their territory. She had never seen a pack organize itself this tightly around a running vehicle and approach this close. "They shouldn't be doing this," Elena said quietly. "They should be avoiding the vehicle." One of the wolves on the right moved closer. Pale dawn light caught in its yellow eyes beneath the shadow of the trees. It lowered its shoulders, peeled back its lips, and released a growl deep enough that all four people could hear it through the closed windows. Another wolf approached the rear door, sniffed around the tire, then lifted its head toward the cabin. Jamie instinctively moved away from the glass, still gripping her camera but no longer framing anything useful. Grant turned and filmed the wolf beside the vehicle. His hand was shaking visibly on the grip, making the image tremble, but he didn't stop recording. His instincts were simple now. Capture it first, think later. Cole looked up at the roof, then at the sunroof. He asked Elena whether the wolves could break the windows. She didn't answer immediately. Wolves didn't normally attack vehicles, but almost everything happening in front of them had already gone beyond what she considered normal. One wolf suddenly sprang against the right side door, its front paws striking the metal hard enough to make Jamie cry out. Its claws scraped downward before it dropped back to the ground. Another wolf immediately moved into the space it had left, almost as if responding to the first animal's movement. Cole looked around one more time and made his decision. Roof. Through the sunroof, one at a time. Don't open the side doors. Grant thought he had misheard him. The roof? If the glass goes, we're trapped in here. Cole pointed upward. Up there, at least they can't come straight at us. Elena didn't argue. She slipped the GPS strap from around her neck, shoved the receiver into her jacket, then climbed onto the middle seat. Grant held the camera with one hand and opened the sunroof with the other. Cold air and the smell of wet earth poured into the vehicle, along with growling that sounded much louder without the glass between them. Elena reached both hands to the edge of the roof and pulled herself through first. Cole supported her legs from below until she was kneeling on top. Jamie went next. She tried to hand her camera to Grant, but he told her to keep the strap across her shoulder. She planted one foot on the seatback and pushed her head and shoulders through the opening. At that exact moment, a wolf on the right lunged upward, its forelegs striking the door before sliding toward the wheel. Jamie flinched, lost her footing, and nearly dropped back into the cabin. Elena caught her wrist from above and pulled hard. Jamie had just gotten her last leg onto the roof when the wolf jumped again. Its jaws snapped so close to her pant leg that the fabric stretched for an instant before slipping free. Jamie rolled onto the roof, breathing hard, her face drained of color. Grant climbed up after her, still holding the camera. Cole came last. He switched off the engine, took the key, then climbed through the sunroof while the other three held his arms. Once all four were on top, Cole slid the glass panel as close to shut as he could. Below them, the wolves continued circling the vehicle. From the roof, the formation was easier to see. The 11 wolves weren't clustered together. They were spaced around the vehicle, with the alpha still holding the front, while the others shifted position whenever someone on the roof moved. Elena scanned the pack, trying to find something she could explain through ordinary territorial behavior. No wolf broke away. None barked a warning and retreated. They maintained pressure, gradually tightening the space around the vehicle while still moving with an order that unsettled her more than a chaotic attack would have. Cole checked his phone. No signal. Grant checked his. Jamie did the same. Not one of them had even a single bar. The nearest place from which they could realistically call for help was miles away. One wolf placed its front paws on the rear bumper and tried to spring upward. The roof was beyond its direct reach, but not by enough to make anyone feel safe. Cole told everyone to stay close to the center and away from the edges. Grant crouched low with the camera aimed down at the pack. Jamie asked how long they might have to stay up there. Elena didn't answer. She looked at the Alpha, then at the others shifting around the vehicle. What worried her most was no longer whether they might attack. It was why they were doing this at all. Cole was the first to think of fire. He remembered an oil-soaked cleaning rag in the tool bag behind the driver's seat, and a section of aluminum tubing left over from a camera mount they had replaced on an earlier trip. The problem was that everything was still inside the vehicle. He lay flat on the roof and lowered himself through the sunroof while Elena held his belt from behind. The wolves reacted immediately. 2 moved toward the driver's side, and 1 jumped against the body of the vehicle. Cole forced himself not to look down, reached behind the seat, and dragged the tool bag upward. As his head came back through the opening, a set of jaws snapped shut below the sunroof, only a few feet from his wrist. He opened the bag and pulled out the darkened rag and a metal tube nearly 2 feet long. Grant understood immediately. Together they wrapped the cloth around one end of the tube and secured it as tightly as possible with a short length of wire. Elena found a small bottle of flammable optical cleaning solution with only a little left at the bottom, and poured enough onto the cloth to soak it. Jamie searched her pockets for a lighter. Nothing. Grant remembered the small lighter he kept in his pants for melting the ends of nylon cord when repairing equipment. It took him 2 tries to get a flame, because the wind was stronger on the roof than it had been below. The oily rag caught slowly, then flared. The wolves reacted almost instantly. The 3 closest animals jumped back, and 1 slipped on the gravel as it turned away. Others lowered themselves, ears flattening. Elena took the improvised torch from Grant and swept it slowly in an arc around the edge of the roof. Orange flame stood out against the gray dawn, flashing in the wolves' eyes as they moved. A wider gap opened around the vehicle. Jamie let out a breath so sharply it almost became a laugh. But the wolves didn't leave. They adjusted. Those nearest the flame backed away while the animals on the opposite side immediately moved closer. Elena turned and swung the torch in that direction. The pack shifted again. They wouldn't rush the fire, but they also refused to abandon the circle. The Alpha stayed farther back than all the others near a boulder ahead watching. The scar across its muzzle appeared each time the flame passed in front of it. It didn't flatten its ears or retreat into the trees. Every time Elena shifted the torch, the wolf turned its head with the movement, as though studying the pattern rather than reacting in panic. Grant aimed the camera at it. Through the lens, he realized the wolf wasn't watching Elena. It was watching the flame itself. It stood motionless and waited. "It knows the fire is going to die," Grant said. Elena didn't disagree. She kept moving the torch, but her arm was already beginning to tire. The oily cloth was burning faster than they had hoped. The cleaning fluid had produced a strong flame at first, but once that burned away, the fire shrank around the blackening fabric. Cole searched the bag for something else they could burn. There wasn't another piece of cloth large enough. Jamie, her voice trembling, asked whether they had a flare gun or emergency flare. The question made the other 3 look at her, and then at the equipment scattered around them. They had planned to be out filming for only a few hours, not to spend the night in the wilderness. Nobody had brought one. Cole tried the handheld radio, but all he got was static. He raised the antenna, changed channels, and called again. Nothing. Grant checked the time. It was only a little after 5 in the morning. If they failed to return when expected, it would be hours before anyone at the station even began to suspect something was wrong. Even then, the road into this area branched in several directions. Nobody had any reason to appear at exactly the right place. The torch dwindled to a small cluster of flame. Elena switched hands. The smell of scorched cloth and solvent drifted over the roof. The wolves began moving closer by inches. They weren't rushing. One sat down several yards away as if conserving energy. 2 others circled behind the vehicle and stopped. The Alpha remained where it had been, patient enough to be frightening. Elena looked at it, and finally said what she had been trying not to say. This didn't resemble normal predatory behavior. A hungry pack might test an opportunity, but it would also weigh risk. A vehicle, open flame, and 4 humans should have been enough to make them withdraw. Something had changed their willingness to accept danger. Jamie asked whether the wolves might be protecting pups nearby. Elena said that if that were the case, they would normally try to push the threat out of the area, not keep 4 humans trapped in the middle of the road. She glanced at the GPS receiver inside her jacket and then back toward the forest. The strange movements they had been seeing for 2 weeks suddenly carried a different meaning. Maybe the wolves weren't simply defending territory. Maybe something else had been forcing them into this part of it. A sudden gust swept through the ravine. The flame bent sharply, flared one last time, then collapsed. Elena twisted the torch away from the wind, but most of the cloth had already burned through. There was a small sputter, and the flame vanished. The tip of the metal tube glowed red for a moment before fading into darkness. The Alpha stepped away from the boulder. One step, then another. The wolves on both sides immediately stood and moved with it. The circle tightened around the vehicle. Grant could hear claws scratching over gravel, Jamie's breathing beside him, and Elena telling everyone not to wave their arms or shout. Cole held the dead metal tube like a club, even though all 4 of them knew it wasn't long enough to stop a wolf if one managed to jump onto the edge of the roof. The Alpha was less than 10 feet from the front of the vehicle when the first sound came from the forest. It was so low that Grant initially thought a large rock had shifted somewhere on the slope, but there was no crash, only one heavy impact followed by silence. A few seconds later, the sound came again. This time it was clearer, like an enormous foot settling onto soft ground. Then another. The Alpha froze in mid-step. Its ears rose, and its head turned toward the forest on the right side of the road. The other wolves reacted almost at the same moment. For the first time since the circle had formed, they stopped looking at the people on the roof and stared between the trees. Grant glanced down, thinking the vehicle had begun sliding on the sloped trail, but the wheels hadn't moved. The vibration was coming through the ground. Cole felt it too. He placed one hand flat against the metal roof and looked toward the forest. "That's not a bear," he said, though it sounded more like a judgment he was making for himself than an explanation for anyone else. Grant aimed the camera toward the sound. The trees ahead were still darker than the sky behind them, layers of low branches and alder woven together. One branch shook. Then an entire cluster of brush shifted sideways, as though something large was moving straight through instead of going around it. The footsteps continued, slow and even, each one closer than the last. The wolves began to change posture. Several lowered their bodies, but no longer toward the vehicle. 2 backed away. The Alpha held its position, eyes fixed on the section of forest that was moving. Elena watched their reaction and realized it frightened her more than the sound itself. 11 wolves had surrounded 4 humans without hesitation, but whatever was coming had made the entire pack stop. A new smell reached them, a mixture of wet animal fur, decaying earth, and something so strong that Jamie covered her mouth. Cole's face tightened. Elena kept staring toward the trees. Wood cracked. A low branch was shoved sideways and didn't spring back. Grant increased the zoom, but captured only a dark mass moving behind the leaves. He fought to keep the camera steady. The next impact shook the ground hard enough to make the camera mount, attached to the roof, tap softly against the metal. Grant saw the wolves' reaction through the screen and understood that whatever was approaching had changed the situation completely. Every living thing around that vehicle was waiting for something else to enter the road. The alder directly in front of the vehicle began shaking violently. Dawn spilled through a widening gap, turning the background gray-gold and outlining a dark mass in the middle. The shape behind the brush rose higher and higher, its shoulders spreading between 2 tree trunks, as though the forest itself were too narrow to contain it. Grant had to tilt the camera upward. Cole still held the burned-out metal tube, but his hand had dropped to his side. A gigantic figure stepped onto the trail in front of the vehicle and stood fully upright, more than twice the height of anyone in the crew. The rising light behind it disappeared behind the enormous body, leaving only a thin outline of dawn around its shoulders and head. The creature stepped fully out of the trees and stopped directly in front of the vehicle, where the growing dawn gave Grant just enough light to understand the proportions his camera was recording. He had to tilt his head back and raise the camera above his shoulder to fit the entire figure into the frame. It stood nearly 10 feet tall, its head rising well above the roof where all 4 of them were positioned. Dark brown fur covered it from head to foot, clumped with mud and moisture, hiding much of the body's definition, but doing nothing to conceal the enormous width of its shoulders or the unnatural length of its arms. Its forearms hung low, almost to its knees, and its hands looked larger than any human hands Grant had ever seen through a lens. Cole couldn't take his eyes off it. A bear could rise onto its hind legs, but its weight distribution was different, and the hips and shoulders never formed a stable upright axis like this. The creature in front of them stood naturally, knees slightly bent, feet planted wide on the gravel as though its body had been built to move on 2 legs. Cole spoke quietly, his voice rough with tension. "That's not a bear. I know what a bear looks like standing up. This is something else." Elena didn't answer. She was looking back and forth between the creature and the wolves. The scar-faced Alpha, already the largest member of the pack and probably close to 110 pounds, suddenly looked small by comparison. The creature in front of the vehicle could easily have weighed 6 or 7 times as much. The difference showed in everything: height, arm length, muscle mass, even the distance it could reach before a wolf would have a chance to get close to its body. Its smell reached the roof as the wind shifted. Jamie covered her mouth almost immediately. Through the camera, Grant noticed that the creature didn't look directly at them at first. It looked at the wolves. The pack reacted almost as one. The wolves that had been closing in on the vehicle stopped, lowered their bodies, and turned toward the creature. 2 farther behind backed toward the tree line. One on the left gave a short, high whine, lips pulled back, but didn't move any closer. The Alpha held its ground the longest. It faced the creature across the open stretch of road, ears upright at first, and then slowly drawing back. Its tail hung lower than it had during the siege around the vehicle. Elena recognized the change immediately. Grant adjusted the focus toward the creature's face. It had a low forehead, a heavy brow ridge, and a nose that was wider and flatter than a human nose. The hair along the sides of its face was shorter than the fur on its neck and shoulders, exposing dark skin beneath. Its eyes sat deep under the brow. They weren't wide with panic or rage. The creature watched the Alpha, then shifted its gaze across the rest of the pack. Elena placed one hand on Jamie's shoulder to keep her low. Cole still held the burned-out metal tube, but he lowered it close to the roof, avoiding any movement that might be interpreted as a threat. The creature stood motionless in the middle of the trail for several long seconds, long enough for them to hear water running somewhere far below in the ravine. It tilted its head slightly, looked toward the Alpha, then toward the vehicle. The Alpha edged forward half a step. The creature immediately shifted its weight toward the front, but only slightly. Its shoulders rose, and its arms moved a few inches away from its sides. That alone was enough to stop the wolf. Then the creature opened its mouth. The sound that came out was nothing like the repeated roar of a bear or the long, rising howl of a wolf. It was a single vocalization, beginning deep inside the chest and building into a broad, low roar, powerful enough that Grant felt the roof tremble beneath his knees. The sound swept down the narrow trail, struck the rock wall on the left, and came back in layers of echo. The creature didn't roar again. It didn't charge after making the sound. It gave one signal and waited. The wolves reacted almost simultaneously. The alpha stepped backward first. Two wolves near the right side turned their bodies away and opened more distance from the road. Three farther back began retreating into the trees, but they didn't scatter in panic. They maintained spacing, backing away while keeping their eyes on the creature. The others followed within seconds. Elena had watched thousands of hours of pack behavior, and what she was seeing looked more like a collective decision than blind fear. The pack hadn't collapsed. They had received a signal, judged the risk, and decided to withdraw. The alpha was the last one to leave. It stood less than 20 yards from the creature, lips still drawn back, but its body was already angled toward the forest. The Bigfoot didn't pursue it. It remained where it was, arms hanging low, eyes fixed on the wolf. Finally, the alpha turned, ran several steps, and disappeared behind the pines. All that remained was the shaking of branches and the fading rhythm of paws moving deeper into the woods. Elena looked around. All 11 wolves were gone. The creature still hadn't moved. Grant felt his hands begin to shake even harder now that the immediate danger from the pack was gone. While they had been surrounded, everything had happened too quickly for him to think. Now, the road in front of them was empty except for a gigantic Bigfoot standing less than 30 feet from the vehicle, and the fear changed into something else. They had no idea whether the wolves had been the only target or whether they were simply the first part of what was about to happen. "Don't turn it off," Grant whispered. "Don't turn it off, Grant." He was talking to himself more than anyone else. The camera was still recording. The image trembled, but the creature's face and upper body were clearly visible in the strengthening morning light. Bigfoot turned its head toward the vehicle. Elena tightened her grip on Jamie's shoulder. Cole didn't raise the metal tube. All 4 of them tried to make themselves as small as possible on the roof. The creature's gaze passed over Cole first, then Elena, then Jamie, and finally stopped on Grant. Grant knew because the direction of its head and eyes changed clearly through the lens. It looked directly at the camera for several seconds. There was no way to know whether it understood what the object was, but the gaze lasted long enough to make Grant feel that he was no longer the only one doing the observing. Something on the other side of the lens was observing him too. Bigfoot tilted its head slightly. It was a small gesture, almost identical to the one it had made while assessing the wolves. Grant held the camera steady. Then the creature turned away. It didn't run. It walked back toward the forest at a slow pace, every stride long and deliberate. When it reached the edge of the road, Bigfoot used one hand to push an alder branch aside, moved through the opening, and gradually disappeared behind the trees. There was no second roar, no backward glance, no final threat. Within seconds, only the branches swaying where that massive body had passed gave any sign that it had been there at all. No one on the roof said a word. Grant kept filming the empty forest for nearly another minute. Elena watched the directions the wolves had taken, listening for any sign that they might return. Cole sat still with one hand resting on the metal roof. Jamie lowered her head and wrapped both arms around her knees. With the engine off, the wind moving through the trees, and the cooling metal of the vehicle became strangely loud. Finally, Cole said they needed to leave. He climbed down first through the sunroof. Grant kept the camera moving around the vehicle while Elena and Jamie followed. No wolves appeared. Cole opened the hood and quickly checked the front end, the tires, the undercarriage, and the areas the wolves had struck while jumping against the vehicle. A long claw mark ran down the right door, and several muddy smears covered the rear bumper, but the vehicle was still drivable. Cole had no intention of spending another minute there, doing a more careful inspection. Grant was the last one down. Before lowering himself through the sunroof, he turned the camera one more time toward the forest where Bigfoot had disappeared. Nothing moved. That didn't make him feel any safer. Cole started the engine. It caught on the first turn. Instead of continuing toward the planned filming location, He slowly backed the vehicle toward the wider section of trail behind them. Nobody objected to abandoning the entire morning shoot. Elena still held the GPS receiver, but she wasn't looking at it. Jamie hugged her camera against her chest, with her legs drawn close to the seat. Grant sat in the back, with the main camera across his lap, and didn't stop recording until they were several hundred yards away. For the first several minutes, nobody spoke. There was only the engine, the tires grinding over gravel, and the breathing of 4 people gradually settling back into something close to normal. Cole drove more slowly than he had on the way in. At every curve, he checked the rearview mirror longer than necessary. Grant noticed but didn't ask. He kept looking through the rear window too, half expecting a dark brown figure to appear between the trees. Jamie was the first to break the silence. "Did you get it?" Grant looked at her. Jamie asked again, more clearly this time. "All of it. Did the camera actually get all of that?" The question made Elena turn fully toward the back. Cole didn't turn around, but he eased off the accelerator slightly, as though he were waiting for the answer too. Grant looked down at the camera on his lap. The recording light had gone dark after he stopped filming, but that told him nothing about whether the memory card had survived the shaking, the jolt, while they were climbing onto the roof, or any other failure. He opened the playback screen. His fingers were still trembling as he selected the most recent clip. The first image showed wolves surrounding the vehicle. Grant fast-forwarded. The footage shook violently while the crew climbed onto the roof, then stabilized. The improvised torch appeared. The Alpha moved closer. Then the frame shifted toward the moving forest. He stopped. Bigfoot stepped out. Even though all 4 of them had seen it with their own eyes only a short time earlier. The inside of the vehicle went quiet when the image appeared on the small screen. The creature was clearer than Grant had expected. The light behind it created a bright outline around the body, but its face, arms, and movement were still visible in surprising detail. He advanced the footage to the roar. The microphone clipped at the loudest point, but the sound had been captured. Then the wolves withdrew. The creature looked toward the camera and finally walked back into the forest. Grant exhaled slowly. "I got all of it." Jamie leaned her head against the seat and closed her eyes. Elena held out her hand for the camera. Grant passed it forward only after copying a section onto a backup card, using the device attached to the camera. Professional habit had returned before his mind had fully caught up. One original was never enough. Elena watched the creature's appearance 3 times. The first time, she studied the body. The second, she focused on the wolves' reaction. The third, she stopped at the exact moment Bigfoot released the roar. "This could be the most important footage I've ever seen," she said. Grant asked why she sounded as though that were bad news. Elena watched the screen for several more seconds before handing the camera back. "Because if we release this the wrong way, that place won't stay quiet for a week. People will come pouring in. Bigfoot hunters, reporters, people looking for samples, people with guns, people who just want a picture. And they'll walk straight into the wolves' core territory and the exact place where that creature just appeared." Jamie looked down at her own camera. She asked whether they were really supposed to find evidence like this and then hide it. Grant didn't answer immediately. For 20 years, his job had been to put rare things in front of a camera and bring them to an audience. But rare things in the wild often survived, partly because people didn't know exactly where to find them. Cole spoke from the driver's seat. "First we get back to the station. We back up everything. Then we decide." He kept driving. Every time they passed through a darker section of forest, his eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. Grant caught him doing it once and asked whether he had seen anything. Cole shook his head. "No. I just don't like leaving when we have no idea where that thing is." The road began to widen as they left the core area behind. Morning light now covered the mountain slopes, completely different from the cold gray light they had driven through earlier. Jamie looked out the window, then asked Elena another question. If it hadn't shown up, do you think the wolves really would have attacked us? Elena thought for a long time. She couldn't say for certain. Wild wolves very rarely attacked healthy adult humans as an organized pack, especially when a large vehicle was involved. But she also couldn't explain the formation they had just witnessed through normal behavioral patterns. All I know is they weren't leaving, she said, and when that other thing appeared, they knew exactly what to do. Grant looked down at the dark camera screen. A more important question was beginning to take shape. Had Bigfoot actually come to save them, or had four humans on top of a vehicle simply ended up in the middle of a territorial dispute they didn't understand? If the creature had only intended to drive the wolves out of the area, then the crew's survival might have had nothing to do with its decision. But the way it had looked directly into his lens before leaving made Grant unable to settle for such a simple explanation. When they reached the ranger station, all four got out of the vehicle more slowly than usual. Cole closed the small gate behind them, checked the road one more time, then went inside. Grant kept every memory card on his person. Elena opened a laptop on the long table in the temporary workroom. Jamie pulled the curtains closed, even though full daylight had already arrived. It was unnecessary, but nobody commented. They backed up the files onto two separate drives. Grant recorded the time, card number, and camera name exactly as he did on every project. The familiar routine helped him recover some sense of control. Elena sat beside him and began reviewing the footage from the moment their vehicle entered the narrow trail. She didn't jump straight to the Bigfoot sequence. Instead, she slowed down everything that came before it, comparing timestamps against the GPS signals and the locations where the first wolves had appeared. Grant was labeling one of the drives when Elena froze the image. She dragged the timeline backward several seconds, enlarged the left side of the frame, then leaned closer to the screen. Jamie noticed the change in Elena's face before she could even see what was on the display. "What is it?" Elena didn't answer. She rewound again and stopped at the moment when the vehicle was still moving and no wolf had yet stepped onto the road. In the far left corner, deep behind two tree trunks, there was a dark shape taller and narrower than the surrounding shadows. The color drained from Elena's face. "Grant, go back to this. There's something in the left corner of the frame, right before the wolves started surrounding us." Elena dragged the timeline back exactly 7 seconds and played the footage at 1/4 speed. The vehicle was still creeping along the trail. The wolves had not fully appeared yet, and the dawn light was only strong enough to turn the edges of leaves and tree trunks into blue-gray shapes. In the upper left corner of the frame, behind two pines roughly 40 yards from the road, a dark figure stood completely still. It didn't behave like a tree shadow because its width changed as Grant unconsciously panned the camera to the right. Across 3 consecutive frames, the shape of the shoulders and head remained fixed, then disappeared when the moving vehicle passed behind a cluster of alder. Elena enlarged the image until the pixels broke apart, but the figure still looked far too tall in relation to the surrounding brush. Grant stood close behind her, staring at the screen and then at the timestamp in the corner of the file. That moment had been recorded nearly 2 minutes before the first wolf stepped onto the road. Nobody spoke right away. Jamie sat on the edge of the table with both hands wrapped around a cup of water she still hadn't touched. Cole leaned against the wall with his arms crossed, his eyes shifting from the screen to the window, as though simply seeing that figure made the room feel less secure. Grant asked Elena to play it again. They watched it at normal speed, then at half speed, then frame by frame. The figure was only visible for a few seconds, but what mattered was the way it moved, or rather, the way it didn't. It wasn't crossing through the area like an animal passing by. It was standing there, waiting, and when their vehicle went past, it was still there. Grant immediately opened the drives containing all the scouting footage from the 3 weeks before the main shoot. The crew had placed 8 trail cameras, 2 fixed video units, and 1 audio recorder along creek branches, game trails, and areas where Elena had identified wolf activity. This time, Grant changed the way he searched. He stopped looking at what was in the center of the frame. He studied the edges, the shadows, and the parts of the forest no one would normally have any reason to notice. Nearly an hour later, Jamie found the second appearance. In footage from a trail camera beside a small creek 2 weeks earlier, a cow elk crossed the frame just before midnight. At the 8th second, deep behind a cedar trunk, a dark area, higher than the elk's head, shifted to the left and stopped. There wasn't enough detail to see a face, but the apparent height and shoulder width made Elena immediately calculate scale using the tree they had measured when installing the camera. The figure stood in a position where a 6-foot adult would barely reach the lowest horizontal branch. The top of its head rose almost 2 feet above that. The third appearance was hidden in telephoto footage Grant had shot 11 days earlier near the eastern meadow. At the far right edge of the frame, hundreds of yards from the wolves, a dark brown shape stood between 2 trees. Grant had ignored it at the time, assuming it was the blackened remains of a burned stump. But when Elena compared 3 consecutive frames, the shape changed the angle of its head. It was looking toward the wolves. The 4th appearance came from a fixed camera near one of the artificial scent stations they were using to study behavior. Again, the pattern was the same. The figure always remained at the edge of human activity, always partly concealed by trees or darkness, and always appeared near a place where either the wolves or the crew's equipment had recently been present. Elena pulled the whiteboard closer to the table. She drew a timeline covering the full 3 weeks and marked each day the crew had installed cameras, checked equipment, or tracked GPS signals. The 4 faint appearances were marked in red. The creature hadn't been appearing randomly across the wilderness. It was showing up near areas of strong wolf activity, but also consistently staying far enough away to observe the crew's equipment or movements without being clearly detected. Cole studied the locations and realized something that bothered him. Every one of those points was close to a place he had personally taken the crew to install equipment. He remembered those days clearly. There had been no oversized tracks, no broken branches, no obvious sign that an animal of that size had been standing nearby. If the creature had been there, then it hadn't just known how to avoid being seen. It seemed to know where the cameras were least likely to capture a clear image of it. Jamie finally set down the cup. Her voice was quieter than usual. If it's been watching us for 2 weeks, why did it wait until today to show itself? The question left the room silent for a long time. Grant thought about the moment Bigfoot had stepped onto the road. It hadn't charged. It hadn't roared immediately. It hadn't attacked them. It had looked at the wolves first, assessed the situation, and then released only one sound. If it had seen the crew before, then what happened that morning was becoming harder to dismiss as pure coincidence. But that still didn't mean it had intended to save them. Maybe the humans had only been a small part of whatever the creature had actually been monitoring. Cole looked down at the topographic map again. After a while, he said the possibility that bothered him most. Maybe it wasn't watching us. Maybe it was watching the wolves, and we just happened to walk into the middle of that. Elena didn't reject the idea. She called Dr. Marcus Hale, a former colleague who had spent years studying territorial competition between large predators in the Idaho mountains. She didn't send him any images, and she never used the word Bigfoot. Instead, she described a hypothetical situation involving an 11-wolf pack whose movement had recently expanded in unusual ways, repeatedly leaving its core range and a large unidentified animal appearing along the boundary of that activity. Elena only shared the details she felt could be discussed without revealing the sensitive footage. Marcus explained that when an apex predator begins expanding its range, the cause can be food pressure, reproduction, internal competition, or the presence of another competitor. What stood out in Elena's data was that the wolves weren't expanding evenly in every direction. Their movements showed repeated pushes toward the southwest, followed by retreats, almost as if they were probing an area but never maintaining a long-term presence there. If something large or dangerous enough occupied that region, the wolves could adjust their movement patterns around it, even if humans had never officially documented such an animal. Elena asked whether a solitary animal could force a pack of 11 wolves to alter its boundary. Marcus said it depended on size, ability to inflict injury, and previous encounters. Even one or two dangerous confrontations could create a behavioral boundary, especially if the pack was raising pups and couldn't afford to lose healthy adults. After the call ended, Cole pulled the map closer. He pointed to a deep stretch of forest southwest of their route, an area with few patrol lines and almost no recreational trails. Some locals referred to it as the dead zone, not because of any famous accidents, but because large predators rarely seemed to enter it, even though the terrain, water, and prey base were all suitable. Cole had passed near the edge of that area twice in his life. He remembered finding elk, deer, and bear sign around it, but almost no evidence of wolves traveling deep inside. Elena overlaid the pack's GPS positions on the paper map. The unusual movements from the previous 2 weeks touched almost exactly along the eastern boundary of the zone Cole had identified. The 4 sightings of the large figure also fell along that same edge. Grant began reading down phrases in his notebook: large unidentified animal, activity boundary, wolf avoidance response. The theory came together piece by piece. The creature might have occupied that core area as its territory for years. For reasons they still didn't understand, the 11 wolf pack had recently begun expanding its hunting range toward the boundary. Bigfoot may have been monitoring them for days, possibly weeks, while the film crew unknowingly moved into the exact place where the 2 ranges overlapped. If that was true, then the roar that morning didn't have to be an act of heroism directed toward the humans. It could have been nothing more than a territorial signal aimed at the wolves, with the 4 people on the vehicle benefiting, simply because they happened to be standing in the middle of the confrontation. That explanation made Grant feel both relieved and unsettled. It avoided assigning human emotions such as compassion or rescue instinct to the creature, but it also implied a remarkable degree of behavioral control. The Bigfoot had apparently been able to watch both the wolves and the camera crew without revealing itself, choose exactly when to step into view, issue one warning, and then stop. There had been no wasted movement. Jamie asked what they would say if they released the story. Elena believed the safest version would focus on the wolves' abnormal behavior and leave out the coordinates. Grant looked at the footage open across several screens. Another part of his mind pictured hundreds of people arriving with cameras, drones, trail traps, rifles, and camping gear if the location ever became public. Grant's phone rang. The number wasn't in his contacts. He almost ignored it, but the phone rang again immediately. Grant answered. A man on the other end spoke quickly and introduced himself as an independent researcher studying undocumented animals. He said he had been following Jamie's social media posts since early that morning and wanted to know exactly where in the Frank Church wilderness the footage had been recorded. Before Grant could even ask how he had gotten his number, the caller added that he didn't need the original file. Approximate coordinates would be enough. Grant hung up. He turned toward Jamie. "What did you post?" Jamie froze. She opened her phone, scrolled, and the color drained from her face. After the vehicle had escaped the dangerous area, and they picked up a little signal near the station, she had posted a short, unedited video, simply to let her family know the crew was safe. The clip was only a few seconds long, filmed just after she climbed down from the roof. The image shook, the audio was chaotic, and near the end of the frame a large blurry shape could be seen between the trees. At the time, Jamie hadn't thought anyone outside her family would be able to make out anything meaningful. The post had already been shared hundreds of times. The comments were moving so quickly she had to keep scrolling. Some people asked whether the shape was a bear. Others wrote Bigfoot in capital letters. Dozens of accounts demanded the exact location. Someone had enlarged the distant mountain ridges in the background and tried to identify the area. Another account had placed screenshots beside a map of the Frank Church wilderness and circled 3 possible locations that matched the terrain. Jamie deleted the original post immediately. Her fingers moved so fast that she missed the button twice. When the page refreshed, her upload was gone, but dozens of copies were still circulating on other accounts. Some had already been downloaded, cropped, brightened, and reposted to different forums. Jamie lowered herself into a chair, her eyes filling with tears. "I just wanted my mom to know we were okay." Grant didn't blame her. Nobody in that vehicle had been thinking normally after what happened. But the consequences were already moving faster than they could control. Elena looked at the map on the whiteboard. If the exact location leaked, the danger wouldn't only be to Bigfoot. The wolf pack had pups. Inexperienced people hiking into the core denning area could trigger defensive behavior, leading to an attack, which could then result in wolves being killed or management policy being changed across the entire region. Trail cameras, bait stations, drones, and constant human traffic could also disrupt the territory of the creature they had just encountered. "The most dangerous thing out there right now isn't in the forest," Elena said. "It's the people who think seeing a few seconds of video gives them the right to walk straight into it." Jamie's phone kept vibrating. Grant received 2 more calls from unfamiliar numbers. One caller claimed to be a local reporter. Another didn't identify himself at all and simply asked whether the crew had been somewhere north of the Middle Fork. Messages began arriving with the same question in different forms. Where exactly had it happened? Cole stood and picked up the ranger station's satellite phone. He said the only way to keep the situation from spinning completely out of control was to contact wilderness management first and make an official report. If rumors spread before the authorities knew what was happening, there would be no time to restrict access before people started entering the area. Grant agreed. Elena gathered the minimum amount of data they could safely provide without sending the original footage. Jamie kept reporting reposted clips and requesting removals wherever she had access, even though everyone in the room understood it was already impossible to erase the video completely. It took Cole nearly 20 minutes to reach a senior official responsible for that part of the wilderness. He stepped into the hallway to speak in a low, steady voice. Grant could only hear fragments through the open door. Unusual large animal activity, risk of unauthorized entry, and sensitive coordinates. Inside the room, Elena removed specific GPS points from the files they had open. Grant copied the memory cards to an offline drive and disconnected the laptop from the network. Jamie's phone vibrated again. The new message contained only one sentence. "I know you were near Bear Creek Ridge. Just tell me if I'm right or wrong." She showed the screen to Grant. His face tightened. Whoever was searching had already narrowed the area down more than they had expected. Cole returned a few minutes later, still holding the satellite phone. His expression was more serious than when he had walked out. He said the agency had agreed to send 2 rangers immediately and establish a temporary closure under the official explanation of unusual large wildlife activity. They would block access to the route before morning and turn back any civilian groups trying to enter. Grant asked whether that would be enough. Cole shook his head. "They're sending people now, and they'll close the area, but there's one condition. All 4 of us have to go back to the site with them tonight and confirm the exact location before daylight, before anyone else gets there first." That night, Cole's vehicle returned to the same trail under the cold white sweep of the headlights, carrying Grant, Elena, Jamie, and 2 rangers who had been assigned to assist them. Nobody talked the way they had that morning. The first time they entered the area, they had brought cameras, GPS equipment, and the confidence of people who believed they understood the place they were heading into. This time, every bend in the road reminded Grant of something he remembered too clearly. The boulder where the scare-faced Alpha had stood, the section of cliff where the vehicle had no room to turn, the stretch of forest where Bigfoot had stepped into the open. The 2 rangers in the back had only been given a shortened version of what happened. They knew there had been unusual large animal activity in the area and that people might try to enter because information had leaked online. Grant didn't tell them everything they had captured on film. He only said that an unidentified creature had appeared at the scene and that everyone needed to avoid doing anything that might be interpreted as a threat. Cole drove more slowly than usual. Every time the headlights swept across the forest edge, he eased off the accelerator and checked the mirrors. Elena kept the GPS receiver on her lap, watching the wolf collar signals as updated data came in. Jamie didn't hold a camera this time. She sat quietly, with her hands clasped together, occasionally glancing at her phone even though there was no signal. The original post was gone, but copies were still circulating online. The thought that a stranger might already be trying to enter the same area made her more nervous than knowing Bigfoot might still be there. When the vehicle reached the section where the wolves had blocked the road that morning, Cole stopped at a slightly wider stretch and shut off the engine. The 2 rangers got out first, checked the ground with their headlamps, then began putting up temporary warning signs. The official wording only stated that access was restricted because of unusual large wildlife activity. Reflective barrier tape was stretched low across the trail, high enough to force anyone driving or hiking through to stop. Not one sign mentioned Bigfoot. Grant stepped out with the camera hanging against his chest. He had spent the entire drive wondering whether bringing it back was the right thing to do. Part of him knew that cameras were the very reason this story could spread farther than anyone intended. Another part of him couldn't bring himself to leave the place a second time with nothing but memory. He wasn't chasing some sensational shot anymore. He only wanted to know whether the creature from that morning truly belonged to this area or whether its appearance had been a one-time event. While the 2 rangers secured the final stake, Elena called Grant over in a low voice. The GPS receiver had just picked up 2 signals. She checked the collar numbers, and then 3 more points appeared. The wolves had returned close to the area, but none of them were approaching the trail the way they had that morning. The signals formed a broad arc some distance away, mostly to the north and northeast. Elena watched them for several minutes and realized the pack was moving parallel to the old boundary without entering deeper into the southwest. She showed the screen to Cole. He studied it and said the wolves were keeping their distance from the exact part of the forest where Bigfoot had appeared. Nobody had time to discuss it further. From the darkness across the road came a heavy, familiar sound. It wasn't a roar. It wasn't a howl. It was a single footstep landing hard enough on the forest floor to snap dry branches beneath the trees. Then came another, slower than the first, and then another. The sound moved parallel to the group, always staying just beyond the reach of the headlights. Cole raised one hand immediately. Everyone stopped. He didn't pull a knife, didn't shine a flashlight directly into the trees. He simply signaled for everyone to stay quiet and not move closer. The 2 rangers exchanged a look. One instinctively rested a hand on his holster, but Cole shook his head. "Don't do anything. It hasn't come toward us." Grant felt his throat go dry. He turned the camera toward the woods, but didn't switch on any additional light. The monitor showed nothing but black tree trunks and deeper darkness beyond them. The footsteps continued for several beats and then stopped. The forest went still. Elena stood beside the vehicle, looking between the GPS receiver and the darkness. The wolves on the screen had stopped moving too. One of the rangers pulled the final section of barrier tape tight. When he drove the stake into the ground, the metallic impact echoed across the trail. The footsteps shifted several yards farther away, but didn't disappear. The creature was clearly adjusting its position to maintain distance. Grant began to understand what Elena had meant about a boundary. Bigfoot wasn't stepping onto the road to claim it. It was moving alongside them, watching what the humans were doing at the edge of its territory. The work was almost finished when the vehicle's headlights caught two small reflections in the trees. At first, Grant thought they were deer eyes. Then he realized how high they were. The 2 points of light were nearly 9 feet above the ground, motionless between 2 large pines. Nothing else moved. Just a pair of reflected eyes watching the group in silence. Grant slowly lifted the camera. Cole saw the movement but didn't stop him. He only reminded Grant not to take a step forward. Grant adjusted the zoom manually so there would be no motor noise. The darkness on the monitor slowly pulled closer. The 2 bright reflections became eyes set deep beneath a heavy brow. After several exposure adjustments, the outline of the head and shoulders began to emerge. Dark brown fur clumped around the shoulders exactly as it had been that morning. The massive body stood partly behind a cedar trunk, with only about 2/3 of it visible. It was the same creature. Grant kept the camera low and didn't try to get a close-up of its face. Bigfoot stood about 60 yards away, far enough that everyone understood the disc had been chosen deliberately. Both arms hung at its sides, one hand resting lightly against the tree trunk. There was no threatening posture. No sign it intended to rush them. The creature looked toward the warning signs, then the 2 rangers, then the vehicle. Finally, its head turned toward Grant. Elena stood close beside him and whispered that maybe this was the creature's way of confirming the boundary. Not a hostile warning, not an invitation. It was simply standing on its side, watching the humans establish limits on theirs. After everything that had happened that morning, the idea made more sense to Grant than any explanation based on emotion. The 2 rangers completed the closure without moving any deeper into the forest. One recorded the coordinates while the other checked the signs and radioed that the route had been temporarily secured. Through all of it, Bigfoot stayed in the same place. The wolves on the GPS continued to hold their wide arc farther away. 3 species, 3 distances, and not one of them crossed into the space of another. Jamie stood beside the vehicle, looking toward the creature as she wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. The panic from that morning was gone. When everyone began gathering the equipment, she whispered, "Thank you," toward the darkness. Her voice was so soft that even Grant, standing nearby, barely heard it. Bigfoot showed no obvious reaction. It simply kept watching for another moment. Grant lowered the camera. That was when he realized he didn't want to get any closer. For most of his career, the filmmaker in him would have wanted one more clean frame, a better angle, proof sharp enough to silence every argument. Tonight, standing still felt like the answer. The creature knew they were there. They knew it was there. Nobody needed to close the distance. When the first vehicle started, Bigfoot still didn't leave. The 2 rangers climbed into their support vehicle, while Cole slowly turned the crew's vehicle back toward the exit. Grant sat by the window, with the camera resting on his lap, still recording. He looked through the rear glass. The reflected eyes remained between the trees for several more seconds before disappearing as the angle changed. At the final curve before they left the narrow section, Grant saw a large movement in the darkness. Bigfoot turned away and walked deeper into the forest, with the same slow, steady pace it had used that morning. It didn't run, it didn't look back, it made no other sound. On the drive back, all 4 of them were almost completely silent. Grant watched the darkness move past the window and knew the next decision would be harder than facing the wolves had been. A documentary could change what millions of people believed, but it could also turn a quiet wilderness into a destination for people desperate to prove something at any cost. After that night, Grant no longer saw the footage as professional property. It was tied directly to a place, a wolf pack, and a creature that had lived there long before any of them had installed a camera. The next morning, Grant reviewed the nighttime footage. What caught his attention wasn't the reflected eyes. It was the fact that Bigfoot had never crossed the barrier line, even though nothing could have physically stopped it. The creature had remained at the edge of darkness and kept its distance until the humans left. Elena noticed the same thing. If simple curiosity had been driving it, she said, it could easily have come closer. The fact that it didn't made the territorial boundary theory harder to dismiss. Several months later, Grant sat in his editing room with 3 hard drives beside him. Elena joined remotely. Jamie helped organize the footage, and Cole made only one request. Nothing in the final film could reveal enough visual information for viewers to identify the exact trail. They rebuilt the documentary around a different idea from the one they had originally planned. The 11-wolf pack remained at the center of the story, but instead of becoming a conventional hunting film, the project turned into a study of changing wolf territory, abnormal pack behavior under unidentified pressure, and the risks humans create when they push too deeply into sensitive wilderness. The Bigfoot footage remained in the documentary, but Grant shortened it from the original sequence. He blurred identifiable terrain, removed all coordinates, and left out the clearest frames of the creature's face. In the narration, it was described only as an unidentified biological phenomenon recorded at the scene. Nobody called it Bigfoot as a confirmed fact. But nobody tried to explain it away as a bear or a person in a costume either. They let the footage exist exactly as the camera had captured it. The documentary created far more attention than Grant expected. Wildlife audiences focused on the wolves' behavior. Cryptid researchers analyzed the footage frame by frame, studying the creature's height, arm length, gait, and roar. Some called it the best evidence ever captured. Others insisted the footage had been manipulated. The debate continued for months, but Grant, Elena, Cole, and Jamie all gave the same answer. Everything they were willing to make public was already in the film. The wilderness authorities quietly changed access rules for the area. The trail was designated as ecologically sensitive, and public entry was heavily restricted under the official explanation of protecting a recovering wolf population. Several smaller routes leading toward the core zone were closed seasonally as well. No public document mentioned Bigfoot. To Grant, that was far more responsible than launching a campaign to prove the creature existed when nobody could control what would happen afterward. Elena continued monitoring the 11 wolves through GPS data for months. The pack still hunted, bred, and moved through the valleys it had always used, but one change never disappeared. They never returned to the exact area where the vehicle had been surrounded. Every time their movement approached the southwestern boundary, the pack turned away before entering deeper into that zone. No one could prove why, but the pattern repeated often enough that Elena eventually stopped calling it coincidence. During one of the few interviews Grant agreed to after the documentary was released, the host asked the question he had known would come. Did he believe Bigfoot existed? Grant sat quietly for a moment, then smiled. I believe what my camera recorded. The rest, I'll leave for the audience to decide. He never said anything more about the night of the closure. He didn't describe the footsteps moving parallel to them outside the headlights. He didn't talk about the way the wolf pack stayed back while another creature watched the humans establish a boundary. Those details belonged more to the 6 people who had stood there that night than to something meant for public debate. When the final cut of the documentary was locked, Grant added one image to the end credits that Elena hadn't initially known about. It remained on screen for less than 2 seconds. There was no narration, no caption, no location. The frame came from the night they returned to the trail. At the exact moment, the headlights reflected from a pair of eyes standing high between 2 trees. Most of the body was lost in darkness. Only the 2 points of light and the faint outline of one enormous shoulder could be seen. Grant never explained that frame in any interview. To him, it was no longer an invitation to go looking. It was a reminder that somewhere deep inside Frank Church, there was a boundary the wolves had learned not to cross, a boundary humans had only stumbled across by accident, and on the other side of it, something was still watching without needing the world to know exactly where it lived. Grant never publicly confirmed that it was Bigfoot, but he never denied it either. Maybe that was the smartest way to protect a secret bigger than the curiosity of millions of viewers, by protecting the very creature that had stepped in when Grant needed it most. What stays with me most when I tell this story isn't the image of a nearly 10-foot creature facing down 11 wolves at once, even though that has to be one of the most extraordinary things ever captured through a human camera lens. What stays with me is that single roar, one controlled sound, no frenzy, no uncontrolled aggression. Nothing that felt like a blind reflex from a wild animal. It was the action of something that seemed to know exactly what it was doing, and why. The 11 wolves never returned to that place. Maybe they, more than anyone else, understood which boundaries were never meant to be crossed. If you believe Grant and his crew, leave a like and turn on notifications for Bigfoot Sasquatch Stories. And if you have ever felt that someone or something was quietly watching you from deep inside the woods, don't hesitate to tell me about it. I am Victor, and I will see you in the next story.